Welcome everyone to the second installment of our Breastfeeding virtual learning series. Our goal this evening is to explore what we can do with breast milk that was pumped on Shabbat, as well as issues and questions surrounding donated breast milk. Our goal also this evening is to honor all types of feeding babies. So whether you're able to feed your baby breastfed, pumped, formula, donor milk, whatever the way is that your baby is fed, we are so excited to support you in making sure that baby is fed and nourished. We are excited to begin this evening, and without further ado, I turn over to Rabbanit, Jenna, Englender.
Thanks, Jen. So as Jen mentioned, tonight the halachic issues that we're going to be discussing are the questions of what milk pumped on Shabbat, what we may or may not do with it once we've saved it after Shabbat. And in addition to feeding one's own child, we're going to discuss the possibility of donating milk for another family to use. And as I thought about how to frame the discussion tonight, it was clear to me that running through the heart of everything we will say tonight is this very real and painful experience of a parent struggling to feed their baby. So I want to take a moment and use my time to pull on some texts from our tradition that will kind of bring us into the reality of that moment. I've been personally just intrigued lately by the metaphor of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, as a birth. It's a well-discussed idea, this image of going from Mitzrayim, from this narrow place, through waters that split to allow a new people to emerge safely into the freedom of the world. And then there's the wandering in the desert, right? The disorientation, the desire to return to the womb of Egypt, perhaps some sleepless nights. It is clearly, to me, a postpartum period. And if the wilderness of Sinai is the fourth trimester of the Jewish people's birth, what is the milk that they eat or drink to sustain themselves? And of course, the answer is the man, this white, fatty substance that falls as needed and takes on different tastes and forms depending on the needs of the people eating it. It seems very clearly to me the perfect metaphor for breast milk. And we see in the Midrash, which gets carried forward into the Gemara and in Rashi's commentary, we see a direct comparison between the man and the breast milk. In fact, we are told that when the people complain of the foods that they miss from Egypt, the onions, the leeks, the garlic, that the reason the man, which can taste like anything, won't fully satisfy the people's cravings for these foods is because that these are the very foods that a nursing mother is instructed not to eat because they are bad for a baby. Okay, so if the manna from heaven is the milk, that of course makes Hashem a nursing mother. And Rav Aaron spoke on Monday about the power and the image of a breasted God. But in this metaphor of birth, what strikes me is that if the role of the nursing mother is played by God, what does this tell us about the weight, the expectation and responsibility that is required of that nursing mother? We see God struggling to keep the Jewish people alive, to get them to stop crying long enough to eat what they need to survive. And I think anyone who has parented a newborn can relate to the fear and anxiety that accompanies that responsibility. It is a superhuman feat. And yet, we are not God, of course. We are humans, tired, overwhelmed, run through with hormones and feelings of inadequacy. And I am struck not by God's role in the desert, but by the Jewish people's other parent in that postpartum period, Moshe Rabbeinu. Immediately following the people's complaints about the man not tasting how they want, we are given an image of the Jewish people surrounding Moshe, all crying at the openings of their tents. In my head, of course, I'm imagining it being the middle of the night. And we see a somewhat rare instance of, instead of Moshe playing the role of advocate for the Jewish people, saying, please God, don't destroy them. They can't help being ungrateful, right? We see instead him turn to God and say, why have you made this so hard? I can't carry this burden. And then he makes a specific reference to birth. He says, am I the one who conceived this people, who bore them, that you should say to me, nurse them now? Where am I supposed to find food for this people? This burden is too much for me. If this is how it's going to be, he says, kill me. He says that. I don't think I can survive this. I don't think I'm meant for it. And you read that in this context of seeing Yetziat Mitzrayim as a birth, and the Jewish people and Moshe perhaps being postpartum. And what is this but a piercing and all too real image of postpartum anxiety and depression, of the overwhelming pain of a crying baby in the middle of the night, who you can't seem to make feel better, who won't latch or eat and you don't know why. We have other images in our tradition of parents searching for milk for their baby. We are told in Sota that Moshe himself refused to nurse from any of the Egyptian wet nurses. And this is why Miriam was able to offer, Miriam, his sister, was able to offer Yocheved, his mother, as a wet nurse for Moshe. And we are told in Bereshit Rabbah that Esther HaMalka refused to nurse from any wet nurses until Mordechai himself began to lactate and nursed her. So this image is there in our tradition, the panic of a parent whose baby cannot eat what the parent is able to provide, and the superhuman feats that some parents attempt to perform to feed their child. So as we turn to the halachic sources, I know so many of us will have that personal experience running through our minds. And we will hold that, and we are driven by that image as we navigate the halachic possibilities. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'll hand it over to Rabbi Jeff.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Jenna. I just put in the chat a link to two documents. The first is just the two sources that we're going to look at this evening. And the second link is a lengthy tshuva that I wrote on this topic some years ago. And that tshuva is in many ways the reason why I'm here this evening. And that tshuva was written at a time when our first son was born, and he was having a hard time latching on. And I believe actually Margot Mann was helpful some years ago. This was about 20 years ago, Margot. I'm not sure if you remember that. And I'm going to just make sure that everybody has access to the document. Hold on one second. And at that time, I was told by my teachers, which is, I believe, actually the standard psak, that if you express milk on Shabbat, that the milk needs to be discarded. What's called sometimes pumping and dumping. Okay, you should now all have access to the document. I'm just going to update it here, so you'll let me know if you can get on. Just give me a thumbs up, somebody, if you can get on. Thank you very much. And that was extremely painful, both for myself and for my wife. And that led me on a journey to write this article, to research a little bit more. What is the nature of the prohibition of expressing milk on Shabbat, and what are the implications when mothers are pumping, whether for their own children or, as mentioned, for others as well? So in order to understand this question, we have to first figure out what is the nature of the prohibition of expressing milk. Obviously, we're not talking about nursing a child. That's obviously permitted. But what does it mean to nurse? What does it mean to express milk from the woman's body on Shabbat? So there is a position that says that it is in fact a Torah prohibition to express milk from the woman's body, from any mammal's body. And we'll talk a little bit about the problematics of the analogies made here between women and other mammals and cows. It's not a simple problem. But there is a position that says that that is indeed a Torah prohibition. And in order to permit a Torah prohibition, one would have to have a case of pikuach nefesh, of a life-saving concern, that the baby was, God forbid, in the NICU, and something would have to be very extreme to permit any type of pumping on Shabbat, any type of non-direct feeding of the baby. And that is, in many places, that's the standard assumption. And the only way to address that, if you're not going to sort of be directly feeding the child, would be to then pump into some type of a bottle that has soap put into it, so that the milk immediately upon coming out of the woman's body gets spoiled. And that is considered in the halachic system to be so fundamentally different from the malacha to which expressing milk or cholev is connected that it's actually permitted on Shabbat. However, if you start from the assumption that expressing milk from the body of a woman is in fact not a Torah prohibition, but only a rabbinic prohibition, so then you don't need to have the concern of a life-saving situation of the child, God forbid, in the NICU, but you only need to have a tzorech, a need that's slightly less. That could be just the child themselves is maybe sick, or the mother is in physical discomfort because she's engorged and needs to pump. Or there is another chola, another person who's sick, who's not necessarily what's called in halacha befanenu, who's not necessarily sitting right in front of me, but who might benefit from this milk. So if we can knock down the assumption that cholev, that expressing a milk is in fact a Torah prohibition, to only being a rabbinic prohibition, then the level of need that's required is much, much less. So what we're going to look at is two sources from the Shulchan Aruch that I believe prove that in fact there is only a rabbinic prohibition associated with expressing milk on Shabbat. Does everybody have access to those two little texts? So the first text we're going to look at, text number 1 here in Orach Chaim 307, has nothing to do with expressing milk. It has to do with what happens or under what circumstances may you ask a non-Jew to do something for you on Shabbat. And the rule that the Shulchan Aruch is about to articulate is that that's only permitted if what you're asking is in and of itself only otherwise a rabbinic prohibition. So for example, if I'm going to visit my friend who lives on the 27th floor of a building in Manhattan for Shabbos lunch, and I need a doorman to press the button on my behalf. So somebody pressing a button, as I think Rabbanit Lila mentioned last time, electricity by itself is only a rabbinic or a even quasi-rabbinic prohibition. So that's not a Torah prohibition. So I can have somebody press the elevator button for me so that I can go up and have my Shabbos meal. However, if I wanted somebody to turn on a light for me, an incandescent light, that would be a much more complicated conversation. Let's see how the Shulchan Aruch articulates this, first in the context of asking a non-Jew, and then we'll see how that relates to the question of expressing milk. So he says, davar she'eino melacha, something that is not a Torah prohibition, is not a melacha midoraita. A Jew can tell a non-Jew to do that, and is not, as long as it is not a prohibited labor and is only prohibited on Shabbat as a shavut. A shavut is a rabbinic prohibition. So if it's only a rabbinic violation, then it can be done under what circumstances? If and only if it is a case of some minor sickness or something that is very much needed or for a mitzvah purpose. So if I'm going to visit my friend for Shabbos lunch is a mitzvah. Okay, so if there's something that's very much needed, a tzorech harbe, or a minor sickness. So all these things sound very much like what might be needed for a baby who needs to eat their milk or for a woman who's feeling engorged at a given time. So that's the rule that he gives as it relates to asking a non-Jew to do something for you on Shabbat. And then he says, second source, this is now talking about milking an animal, and that analogy is problematic in and of itself. But he says quite simply, one is permitted to tell a non-Jew to milk your animal on Shabbat because of the discomfort that this causes the animal, because the buildup of the milk causes pain. So here he says pretty explicitly that you're allowed to tell a non-Jew to milk a cow on your behalf, which means if we allow for, with all the problematics and the way it makes us feel uncomfortable, the analogy from the cow or any other mammal to a woman, what he's saying in sort of a category level is the expressing of milk from a mammal is only a rabbinic prohibition. Just to sort of make it into a simple math equation, if you can only ask a non-Jew to perform a rabbinic violation, and you're permitted to ask a non-Jew to express milk from a cow, then expressing milk must be only a rabbinic violation. So that's a very simple argument. That being said, and I want to sort of, in the spirit of full disclosure, there are lots of other contemporary rabbis who think that what I just said is totally wrong. Now, I put the text in front of you. You could sort of evaluate them. I gave you a list of sort of a major set of 4 significant rabbis in the history of halacha, one of whom, the last one on that list, Rabbi Ben Sion Uziel, who was the Sephardi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, and was positing on behalf of all of the kibbutzim, which is a major psak in his time. And it is on this basis that all kibbutzim today milk cows over Shabbat with a machine of some sort, an automated process. And so while it is true that this is not the only approach to these texts, this is a substantive major approach of a large group of contemporary major achronim. And if you're interested in sort of unpacking all of the history behind this, going back to the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Gemara, you're welcome to read my tshuva. I will say just in one final parting note that I've written a number of pieces over the years. This is one of the very few tshuvot that I've written or articles that I've written that I get cold calls about from women typically all these years later. I probably get about 10 random phone calls a year. You wrote this tshuva. Can you explain this to me? From people that I don't know. Some of them are the students and graduates of Yeshivat Maharat, but some of them are women from around the world who Google nursing on Shabbat and they come across this tshuva, and it's actually been much more influential than almost anything else I've ever written. And hopefully we can sort of, with this, get it more out into the world so that women can know that in fact one does not need to discard milk that is expressed on Shabbat. I'll turn it over to Rabba Melissa.
Thank you, Reb Jeff. And I unmuted myself as Jenna was unmuting me also. So thank you, Reb Jeff. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I just want to say that a number of those cold calls you get, Reb Jeff, maybe from people who reach out to me and ask me questions. And I say, you should also read, like, we'll have a conversation, and also you can look at this piece that my Rosh Hashiva wrote, because these are questions I get a lot. I have been involved in this world as a nursing and pumping and breast milk donating mom, in addition to as a Maharat alum. So it's my honor to get to share with you a little bit about donating milk, some of the concerns there. There actually aren't so many halachic concerns, despite the fact that people think that there are, or that there should be. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to keep it concise so that we can have a lot of time for questions. A lot of questions came up on Monday. We are thinking of this as a series, sort of continuing the conversation, and we would love to hear more questions from you all. So we're going to dive into donating breast milk on Shabbat. So here we go. So there are four key questions which I get asked. So they are as such. Do I have a halachic imperative to donate? Right? Interesting. To whom may I donate? From whom may I receive milk? And are there any kashrut concerns, right? Once I bring this milk into my home, are there concerns also in my kitchen? And so I do get asked all four of these questions. So I thought we'd take a minute to discuss each of them in turn. So do you have a halachic imperative to donate? So there's the idea of a prominent idea in Judaism of bal tashchit. I believe that one is obligated to not throw out the milk if it can be avoided on the basis of bal tashchit, right? Rambam is very clear in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Malachim 6:10, he says, you can read it, amongst it he says, one who wastes food in a destructive manner. Throwing away breast milk, which I'll say more about that in a second, is absolutely wasteful in a destructive manner. We know that there are lots of wonderful ways of feeding a child. Breast milk is not only food, but can also, in many cases, for those for whom donation is important, breast milk also takes on a medicinal quality, particularly for babies born premature, babies in the NICU. It's an extra big consideration for those infants. And so I think that when you add on that level, like, it's an even higher imperative, right? That's all I wanted to say about that. So to whom may one donate? So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah 26a says this is when it's complicated, right? So they say that a Jew can provide medical treatment to an elder during the week, but not on Shabbat, right? So if we're concerned about milk pumped on Shabbat, particularly in question here, this is a problem, right? And that's comes down to our Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, right? Like mainstream, this is what we codify. The Ramban, however, believes that counting and saving a ger toshav, or he counts helping and saving a ger toshav as a mitzvah in his count of the mitzvot. And there are modern rabbinic leaders, including Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who extrapolate that to include everyone. There's also another idea which comes out through the literature, through the halachic literature, around the idea of who one may care for on Shabbat, also around the idea that if someone saw a religious Jew not helping someone on Shabbat, that would be very bad for the Jews. And there are some other contemporary poskim that also pick up on that thread. It's very bad for the Jews is a little harder to like really, for me, it's harder to like sink my teeth into than this thread that gets pulled out from the Ramban. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Gadol B'Torah, says very clearly a refusal to treat the non-Jew on the Sabbath would be totally unacceptable, right? Very point blank. This is something we have to do. It doesn't matter which camp you're in. Bottom line, we have to treat a non-Jew. So if we have to treat a non-Jew on Shabbat, right, and potentially, right, Isorei D'Oraita, that we could be breaking, they're not qualifying it, right? You can only do things that are D'Rabbanan, like we were just talking about with Reb Jeff. So if that's the case, and if we're talking about the fact that breast milk is, that pumping of breast milk, extracting of breast milk is, we're holding that it, right, we're positing that it's a D'Rabbanan Isur to be pumping with a pump. So if that's the truth, if that's the case, then it seems obvious that one may, if one is saving their breast milk in order to donate it, after having pumped it for any reason, one may have pumped on Shabbat, whether that is you were pumping to feed your baby and you wound up having more than your baby needed, whether that is because you are engorged and you need the physical relief, whether that is because you are pumping to prevent mastitis, which may or may not be linked to engorgement. We talked about mastitis a bunch on Monday also, right? There are serious health concerns that can go along with that. So pumping to prevent mastitis is in and of itself a very holy endeavor. On that note, I just want to take a moment to also mention there are a few different approaches to donating milk, which I think Rabbi Lila Kajdan will speak about a little bit more in a moment. Some of the nuances of this, but there are two primary methods, right? One can donate to a milk bank, or one can donate what is often called mom-to-mom donations. They really should be called parent-to-parent because we know that it is not only moms who are soliciting breast milk for their children. But so there are those two. So in a milk bank, there's a lot of screening which is done, both of the donor and of the recipient, right? Typically to receive milk from a milk bank, you need a prescription, right? So again, that echoes back to that medicinal quality that breast milk can have. Prescriptions for breast milk are typically for NICU babies and babies with failure to thrive, like who aren't gaining enough weight, who are having a hard time with formulas are not working. They are not giving them the nutrients and the fattiness that is needed, sort of alluding back to something that Rabbanit Jenna said in the beginning. And the other approach is, right, this parent-to-parent donation. And in parent-to-parent donation, right, you don't have any of that screening. However, there is more access for families to be able to get the milk that they feel that they need for their child. And that does, one can understand that does set up some problems. There are many lactation consultants out there who would not advocate for parent-to-parent donation. And there are others who will, and who will guide and support that is the right choice. So it's important to sort of, as you're making any of these decisions, or as you are counseling anyone who is making any of these decisions, to really think through what are the pros and cons of the different approaches, and really approach them with as clear of a head as is possible in the emotionally charged moments involved in these decision-making processes. So that said, from whom may I receive milk, right? Whether it's coming from a milk bank or coming from being solicited parent to parent. So as Rabbanit Sarana taught on Monday in the Gemara from Yevamot 114a, a baby may nurse from a non-Jew. It's spelled out pretty clearly in that piece of Gemara. And even a camel, right? And so we're really lowering the level there of like, there's no question about the milk for the baby. So from that perspective, there is, however, a tradition of believing that that what a person eats affects their soul. And so since a mother's milk is highly influenced by the food that she is eating, one could see how that would then track into concern for what the baby is eating. So for people that are particularly concerned about that, they should seek out donors or utilize the kosher milk banks if they are accessible. An important note about this is that many rabbis who promote this approach in conversations with women will say that, again, this will reiterate, this is not a halachic dictum. This is a spiritual dictum. So if one does not have access to donated breast milk, which meets one's standards of kashrut, one should accept the milk that they can get. If the milk is, right, I guess, right, again, you have to weigh, a family will have to weigh their options. But if breast milk is needed particularly in that case, to utilize whatever milk is accessible. So again, while it's not imperative, there is a milk bank in New York. It is called, I have to check my notes, Lev Rachel Bikur Cholim of Lakewood. And it was the state's first, and at the time that I first learned about it, the only, I don't know the particulars of how it operates, but it is a kosher milk bank where they only accept milk from women who keep strict levels of kashrut, and they only give to women who are looking for that. All the milk there is processed and stored totally separately, which is just a cool opportunity for women for whom that's very important, right? It's continuing to find ways to make this accessible. And there's a Facebook group called, so there's a large part of the movement, you have to know the context for this to be a fun name, a large part of the movement of parent-to-parent donation is through an organization that has lots of local auspices called Human Milk for Human Babies. So there is a kosher offshoot called Kosher Milk for Kosher Babies, which is fun. I think that there are questions. We will get to them in a moment. So are there kashrut concerns about this? So all breast milk is kosher, pretty point blank. Scholten-Gutierrez is pretty explicit about that. And it often gets compared to honey. It's actually the next piece in the Scholten-Gutierrez there, right? They are parved by byproducts of non-kosher beings. They're treated as parved because it's not connected to the animal. So additionally, Chalav Yisrael, for those for whom that is a concern, has no bearing on the question, as it's a rabbinic injunction on milk derived from kosher animals, right? It's set up in a very specific way. So it doesn't actually apply to mother's milk from that perspective. Again, for people who are concerned about the spirituality concern of what is in the milk, then they may be concerned about Chalav Yisrael, but for the milk itself, when one is handling and dealing with the milk, right? You've received a bag of frozen milk. What am I doing with this bag of frozen milk? There are no concerns about that. It is treated as a parv object. And I just throw out there that as an extra level of precaution, if you're feeling like this just doesn't feel right, from a kashrut perspective, washing your bottles in warm but not hot water with soap reduces any extra ickies, for lack of a better word, that you might have from that perspective. I'm going to stop my share now and see what some of these questions are. Although we're going to wait and we're gonna wait and take questions later. Okay, with that, I turn to Rabbi Lila Kajdan to speak a little to some of the ethical underpinnings of saving and donating our milk.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all this evening. And really, Kvod HaRabbanim, it's wonderful to be here with so many trusted colleagues. Good to learn from one another about such important subject matter. Really, what I see my role as for this evening is a little bit different than the other contributors this evening. Although I do answer halachic questions around this issue with frequency, I'm really going to focus on some of the halachic elements, but very much root them in an ethical framework, specifically thinking about my role as a bioethicist. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the big ethical issues that come up with regard to the issue of at hand, which is really banking breast milk on Shabbat and banking in general. I think it's important to have a sense of the larger context in thinking about these issues, just to root us in a system that already exists. And as always, I think there's an opportunity here to be engaged in what I think is a real holy activity and holy practice of myth busting. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the Q&A to go through some of that. So the key ethical considerations really around milk banking in general include issues around medical decision-making, informed consent, increasing the limited supply of human milk. We are in a time in this country, especially around the world, where we're very much focused on scarcity of resources. And so this is certainly a scarce resource. How ethically to allocate the scarce resource, and also concerns linked to marketing of human milk and also infant formula, because of course there are a myriad ways of nourishing babies. And so when we talk about marketing, this actually comes into play a fair bit. I'm very curious about certain other topics. I don't think we'll get into them in depth today, but other areas of my research have been around paying for breast milk, selling breast milk, the potential of some forms of abuse around wet nurse, in other words, acquiring somebody to nurse one's baby on your behalf. And really, a lot of these issues are rooted in different principles of bioethics. So specifically beneficence, that desire and the principles of bioethics to do good, that good intent, rooted in the principle of justice. This comes up whenever we're talking about scarce resources. And also when we talk about resources, we talk about this specific issue that we're engaged in this evening about disposing of breast milk or the potential of disposing of breast milk on Shabbat. I also just want to highlight the issues around a pressure. I think it's it falls into the ethical domain, that consideration around pressure to pump, pressure to store, pressure to bank. Also the issue from a health perspective of regulating and screening. So the emphasis on disease screen, overall health and wellness, regulation when it comes to breast milk as well. And I think one of the other issues that comes up in that question around the principle of justice is who has access to banked milk and who doesn't. So when I'm thinking about justice in this issue, I think about the ways in which not all distribution of human donor milk is equitable. Medicaid reimbursement, for example, and insurance coverage for donor milk is limited. And oftentimes this leaves very vulnerable infants at risk of not receiving donor milk. So something to think about in that realm of justice, of tzedek, of tzedakah, of charity, also in thinking about equal access to that as well. There's actually only 6 states in the United States that provide Medicaid coverage for donor milk. So something to think about, especially as we are functioning here with an assumed value of breast milk. So really breast milk becomes here a commodity. And when we talk about commodification of any element or any substance, there is a possibility and a potential for abuse. I brought up the issue earlier of beneficence. So when I think about beneficence, an ethical principle, I think what is in the best interest of the patient here being a baby, the implications being that it is in the best interest of this baby to receive breast milk if that's indicated for the baby. And so therefore a healthcare team is really responsible for informing parents of the benefits of donor milk for an infant and for an infant's growth and development when a mother's milk is not available. There, of course, again, I want to say this over and over again, there are many ways to nourish babies that are responsible and healthful. In this regard, the healthcare team also has to provide support for a mom's own personal lactation efforts. And interestingly, there's been a systematic review of in neonatal intensive care units that provided donor milk supplementation, and they reported improved breastfeeding rates for moms at discharge. So just to think about that in terms of transparency and offering holistic care to patients and their families. So when it comes to the Jewish issues, I'm thinking of a few that come to mind. So one, of course, is disposing of breast milk on Shabbat, the issue of bel tashchit, the issue of waste, and specifically waste of a limited resource. Breast milk is not an unlimited resource, and it is something to think of, I think, in a very deep way when it comes to disposal. Bel tashchit is something that I think many day schools, for example, and many other people studied just in the past week in the study of an observance of the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, the the holiday where we celebrate the New Year's of the trees, a kind of a Jewish Arbor Day. And so a focus on waste is often surrounds, I think, environmentalism. And I'd like to make the case that waste can function, and the issue of wasting as a very real and very concerning transgression in the Jewish tradition is very much rooted in this issue, certainly in a time in America where there is so many people are living with so little. This is, I think, a big transgression, and not just sort of a something to be aspirational about. And waste oftentimes begets other waste. So we want to be very vigilant around not wasting a scarce resource. There's also, of course, the issues, and this was discussed already, the ideas of pumping on Shabbat, banking milk on Shabbat, also outside of the Jewish community, for somebody outside of the Jewish community to benefit from. I'm operating, and I always operate with the Ramban, the idea of Nachmanides, that in fact, we're commanded to save a life of a non-Jew and to save them from harm. And we ought to engage in healing them. So the idea of sharing resources and not keeping them limited only to the Jewish community, this is a very common conversation in the Jewish community. It's not limited to breast milk specifically. It's an issue around organ donation as well, kind of a larger conversation for another time. I'd like to make an argument and a case for the way in which breast milk banking also fulfills an obligation around pikuach nefesh, around saving a life. We're talking about nourishment here. We're talking about health and wellness for mom and for baby. We're also not only talking about the physical discomfort or physical issues relating to breast milk, but we're also talking about mental anguish as well. And in that regard, when we think about mental anguish, I also want to bring up the consideration around pressure and shaming and comfort levels around breastfeeding and not. So even in this conversation, when we talk about banking, we have to be mindful of the individuals who might seek out a bank for a whole host of reasons. And we know in our tradition that embarrassing somebody or shaming somebody, it's as if you have killed somebody in public. In other words, it is so critical to honor the individual and their choices, to not offer any shame for choices that individuals make, that it is akin to murder. So something to think about when we're thinking about the diversity of experience, the diversity of need, how individuals might have access to banking, how individuals might be able to seek out this resource, this very scarce and precious resource, and to think about also the ethical framework that this functions in. Ethics and law in many ways go hand in hand, and in many ways have messy conversations one with the other. And you'll notice that I've stuck a little bit more to the ethics piece, but I think there's a tension, and also there's a harmony to the ethics and the law here to this conversation. When ethics and law get into that conversation, the outcome really is a conversation like this, where we root ourselves in a conversation about a law or a transmission or an assumption or an interpretation of a legal premise, and then what to do about it and to make it livable, to make this something that we can v'chayba, we can live with in this world, in the here and now. And I think that's a big part of this conversation about ethics and halacha, especially about this particular subject matter. And I think we'll have an opportunity now to open up to some questions.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So we did have one question or series combo of questions for Rev Jeff. So if you could please clarify if there are parameters for pumping milk on Shabbat and saving it. Like, is it always okay? Is it only if the milk will definitely be needed for your own baby or donated to another baby in need? What if you have plenty of milk in your freezer and you don't plan to donate it? Then should you only pump to avoid engorgement?
Sure. So let me sort of outline what the levels of issues are and add in another piece of the puzzle that would makes it even more less problematic or less halachically problematic. If you're pumping directly for your own child who needs the milk, it sort of seems quite obvious that that's okay. If you're pumping for certainly if the child needs the milk that day and can't latch on for whatever reason. If you're pumping for your own child who's under the age of 1, Halachically, we consider a baby under the age of 1 to be in the category of sakana, sort of, it's a pikuach nefesh kind of a case, and therefore it's also not a problem. So if you're pumping for your own child, it seems clear to me that it's not, there's almost no limitation. The one thing I will add, which you discussed last time with Rabbanit Lila, is also to remind everybody that it's important to use an electric pump and not a hand pump. That the electric pump is considered to be a shinui. It's fundamentally different or an unusual manner relative to using the hand pump, which is more akin to or closer to just directly squeezing the body. And so when you're using an electric pump, which is one type of a shinui, a change or an unusual manner on what is only on the outset a rabbinic prohibition, it actually becomes fundamentally permitted. Now, that being said, there still needs to be some reason that you're expressing. So as long as that reason is for somebody's health, and frankly, when I wrote the tshuva, I don't think I quite understood the power of banking and the sort of the fact that so many people are actually doing that, and I didn't sort of include that as part of my calculus. But the truth is that all milk that gets donated is ultimately for the health of a baby, which is part of why some of the other presenters talked about why, and even for non-Jewish babies, we're not going to get into that. We're not going to give a whole shiur on that topic right now, but even for non-Jewish babies, we can also, give them healing and the nourishment that comes from the breast milk. I would say that that's a further extension, which I believe is possible, but that I haven't written it out, and I'm sort of hesitating a little bit. Meaning, if you're only pumping for the sake of banking, that I think requires, in my mind, a little bit more analysis. And then if you were engorged, it would for sure not be a problem. But if it's only for the sake of banking, I feel like I would need some other additional level of need, like some physical discomfort on the mom's part herself, which will eventually happen kind of anyway over the course of several hours. And assuming we're going to be very careful not to, God forbid, go down the path of mastitis as well. So I would say if you're using an electric pump, it's already a shinui, and therefore in almost every circumstance, I would feel comfortable saving the milk pump expressed on Shabbat.
Thank you, Rev Jeff. We have another question that came in, actually, so don't get too comfortable, Rev Jeff. How does nolad fit in the mix? If you have a choice between feeding your baby the milk you pumped on Shabbat or feeding it to your baby after Shabbat, should you choose to feed it after Shabbat?
Like, is the milk itself nolad because it was like almost like muktzah? Yeah, it would be better if you have such a choice. I guess if you had some in the freezer kind of a thing from during the week, then it would certainly be better to use the milk that after Shabbos it will become totally mutar. But if you have that choice, then it would be better to use the milk that's in the freezer. It's a good question, which I hadn't thought of. Thank you. Guys, you're asking good questions.
If you have any other questions, you're welcome to chat them to me, to Maharat host. We're going to give it just one more minute. This has been a session packed and filled with so much content and a really tremendous follow-up on the first session. So as we give a moment in case anyone has any other questions related to donating milk or saving milk that was pumped on Shabbat, I want to remind you all that the next and final session of this series is 1 week from today on Wednesday, February 10th. And the theme of that session is breastfeeding in public while learning and in synagogue, like 3 different parts. And that will, again, be taking place on May 10th. So we do have 2 more questions that came in. First is for Rabbanit Jenna. How does the golden calf fit into the 4th trimester, like a leap?
That's an amazing question. Now I feel like maybe I need to spend some time really thinking the metaphor out to like its fullest extent. Yeah, it's like maybe a leap. Maybe I think of the golden calf more as like a teenager stage. So maybe we've like really leaped forward at that point, or a toddler stage perhaps. But I think it's all of those kind of push and pull moments are, to me, I guess, in the context of seeing it in that metaphor, or like part of that push and pull of figuring out how do we exist in the world, right? That is essentially what a baby in its fourth trimester is trying to figure out. And it takes a lot of hand-holding and a lot of coaxing and a lot of patience while they figure that out, which we know we can all run short of, even Hashem. So yeah, I don't know. I like the question and I'll think about it more.
Thank you. It's possible that I maybe said the next session is May 10th. In fact, I meant February 10th, just in case that was unclear, 1 week. There was another question that came in. I'm not sure who it's for, so maybe one of you wants to answer it. Would the simple fact of keeping supply up be enough of a justification to add to the other justification? I think that was a Rev Jeff question.
Yeah, it's because that's ultimately for either for your own physical health or for the baby's health. So it's the same. It's a sort of part of the same sort of complex set of ideas. That's all for the sake of either your physical body or the baby's physical body. So yeah, I think it's all a piece of the puzzle. I would also just like to say that this is if we step back for a moment, like what's happening in these conversations, it's actually quite extraordinary. Like we in Yeshivat Maharat take it for granted that women can operate at this level of halachic discourse. And at some level, the fact that we can even ask these questions with this much understanding. The only reason I even thought to ask this question is because my wife was furious at me. And the fact is that women have been kept out of these conversations for hundreds or thousands of years. And so, so my wife she didn't roll over. She wasn't going to let me get away with it. And so that's great. But the fact that all of you exist is like such a breath of, I don't know, it's like, it just makes the Torah feel happier and better. So I just want to thank all of the students and graduates of Yeshivat Maharat.
Thank you. I think that we've covered all of the questions. So if you think of something that you did not yet get to put into the chat and that we didn't get to this evening, I want to invite you to email me. I've put my email into the chat box. And also, I want to invite you that if there's another topic that's burning for you, if there's something that you're really interested in that you would like to, for Maharat to produce some content around, or an evening discussion or another series, I want to invite you to send me that in an email as well. Also, I've put the link in for the registration form. I know many of you did register in advance. It's not an issue that you can't come if you didn't register, but what we would like to be able to do is to send you the recording of this evening, and we will be doing that through the registration list. So if you didn't register for tonight, I want to ask that you please do so that we can send you the recording, and a reminder that the next session is 1 week from tonight, and I'm going to ask 1.5 final questions. So we have a
Jenna,
question from,
Yes. Sorry, just back to the question, because someone sent me a message with the perfect answer to the golden calf question, and I feel like everyone should hear it, which is the answer is that it's separation anxiety, which is, I think, 100% correct. Gabriella said this, that it's the Jewish people saying, wait, God, you're out of the room? Are you gone forever? Have you disappeared? Will you ever come back? So I just thought that was so beautiful and to share. Now, on to the next question, sorry.
No problem. So the question that we have is from someone who runs a milk bank. And she said, we sometimes have bereaved donors whose babies have died, but they want to donate to others. What things do we need to consider halachically in this case? Anyone have an answer?
I can take that question. First of all, just to hold a space for the question, which is one that I think is very, it's a moving one and an emotional one. What an incredible act of selflessness and giving to be able to do that, that act when one is also in mourning and carrying grief. There is no halachic issue that comes to mind in thinking about that. This is, I would say, a radical act of completely, complete selfless tzedakah, a charitable act, and no halachic issues come to mind.
Thank you, Rabbi Lila. Well, with that, I'm going to thank you all for joining us this evening. Remind you that if you did not register, please go ahead and click on the link so that you can register, and invite you all to send more ideas, send more questions. If you send a question to me, I will direct it to the correct person, whether it's a speaker from this evening or from the previous session or from the next session. We'll be happy to make sure that you get your questions answered. And thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.